Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third meeting of the Cider evaluation course. This time, we will discuss advanced topics in cider making. Just wanted to remind you that if you like the video, please hit the like button, and if you have any questions, please comment on the video and I will answer. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to get notified when my next videos come out. In addition, you can see my social media handles changing on the screen right now or find them in the description below. You're welcome to follow me to know when my next projects come out. And now, without further ado, let's get to our presentation of the day about advanced topics in cider making. This is the third presentation of the cider evaluation course, and in it we will focus on advanced topics in cider making. This is the layout of this presentation. We will start by talking about procedures for specific types of ciders, malolactic fermentation, keeving, sulfating, oaking, stabilization, aging, and blending. And let's start with procedures for specific types of cider. Let's start by talking about fruit cider. Any cider made from juice, from apples and other fruits is called a fruit cider. When the cider maker chooses a fruit to combine in a cider, it is important to note that the fruit will complement the apples in terms of acidity and tannins. Fruits with little flavor, such as strawberries, plums, or peaches, in most cases will work great in a cider. Other fruits with strong flavors that are generally used, such as raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, gooseberries, and cherries, need to be limited in amount so that they do not overpower the flavors of the apples in the cider. The cider maker should always pay attention not to add too much fruit so the other fruit does not overpower the taste of the apples in the cider. After the cider maker decided which type of fruit to use, they need to decide when they want to add the fruit. Fruit can be added before the main fermentation, but then volatile aromas escape due to carbon dioxide emitted from the cider during fermentation. On the other hand, fruits can be added in the second fermentation, but then the fruit can add bacteria that will develop in the cider without adding sulfur to inhibit bacterial growth. Or the cider maker can ferment the apple juice separately and the fruit juice separately and blend the fermented juices after fermentation. But using this method can lead to an extended marriage phase as the two fermented juices come together and feel like a uniform drink. If fruits are used, in most cases, the fruits will float on the surface of the liquid with the carbon dioxide. If we do not push the fruit dome into the liquid, the dome can function as an insulation from the environment and preserve the energy that the yeast release into the cider during fermentation, thus raising the temperature. In addition, carbon dioxide cannot leave the liquid and oxygen cannot enter for the yeast in the first stage of fermentation. The fruits that are on top can dry out and become a place for mold to grow. After we talked about cider with fruit, the next thing to discuss is ciders with spices. As with fruits, when thinking about spices, the cider maker has to think about how they are going to introduce them into the cider. There are many methods to add spices to cider, and here are some of them. The first is to add the spices during the main fermentation. However, using this method can introduce contamination or characteristics of overcooked spices. Spices can also be added in second fermentation, but if left for the entire second fermentation, tannins and raw flavors can be extracted from the spices. It is also possible to make a tea from the spices, but then water are added to the cider and the aroma and/or taste can be diluted. Lastly, the cider maker can make a tincture from the spices. A tincture is when the spices are soaked in neutral alcohol, usually vodka, for a few days, and then we add as much alcohol as needed. When spices are used, the cider maker should be conscious that a little goes a long way. Therefore, the cider maker will always add a little spice and test rather than adding a lot and hoping for the best. They can always add more, but it is very easy to overdo with spices. The last thing we will talk about in terms of specialty ciders is cider with added sugar. Chaptalization is the process of adding sugar to fruit juice to make a stronger drink. The factors to pay attention to when adding sugar are the type of sugar to use. Luckily, it depends on the style of the cider. In most cases, the cider maker will add white sugar to make it neutral. But in New England cider, they will actually add brown sugar. The second factor to pay attention to is the effect on the yeast. High levels of sugar in the must can stress the yeast and create fusel alcohols or high esters. Cider styles that use sugar include New England cider that uses brown sugar and apple vine that uses white sugar. These were the specialty cider styles that we need to know for the BJCP cider exam. Now, let's move on to talk about malolactic fermentation. So, what is exactly malolactic fermentation? Malolactic fermentation is the conversion of a molecule of malic acid into one molecule of lactic acid and one molecule of carbon dioxide. Since lactic acid is much less acidic than malic acid, this fermentation or conversion can change the balance of the cider by lowering acidity, removing nutrients, creating phenols, and increasing carbonation in the liquid. The specific changes that occur due to malolactic fermentation depends on the organism that performs it and what conditions the cider was under. Even though there aren't many entries in competitions that have gone through MLF, there are cider styles that have MLF in their flavor profile. So, it's in the knowledge requirements. After understanding what MLF is, the next question is which organisms can perform MLF. Malolactic fermentation is not carried out by yeast of beer or wine that are added to the must, but by bacteria that produces lactic acid. The three classes of lactic acid bacteria that perform MLF are Pediococcus, Oenococcus, and Lactobacillus. The BJCP currently does not have a style for sour cider, so contamination by any strain of Pediococcus will be a problem in any style except specialty or fruit cider. Wine supply store will usually have Oenococcus. In fact, the vast majority of red wines and some white wines undergo malolactic fermentation. There is only one species of Oenococcus, but with several subspecies. The third group, Lactobacillus, has several subspecies that are common in cider and are what gives the phenolics we associate with English cider and to a lesser extent with French cider. Wine yeast like 71B, despite their name on the internet, in fact do not perform MLF. Some of them digest some of the malic acid. But it's not malolactic fermentation. It doesn't create lactic acid and it doesn't create a spicy or smoky phenols. Using these yeast will not turn a New World cider into an English cider. But this variety is useful for reducing acidity and making a cider from very acidic apples. It should be noted that in apple blends with little acidity, these yeast can lower the acidity to a level that the judge will think there is not enough acidity, and even to a level that will allow the development of bacteria in the cider. Having discussed what organisms can perform MLF, the next question to answer is when or under what condition does MLF takes place. Let's start with a condition that limits MLF. The first is high alcohol content. Above 13% ABV, the bacteria will die and malolactic fermentation will not occur. In addition, a low temperature between 15 degrees Celsius will delay the development of bacteria. Too high acidity can also hinder the bacteria from developing. Of course, lack of nutrients also harms the bacteria and not only the yeast. Very high levels of malic acid will also inhibit the bacteria from developing, And finally, if we have more than 30 ppm of sulfite, the bacteria will also die. But we will talk about it later in the presentation. And now, let's talk about the most important thing for us as judges, which is what are the effects of MLF on the cider. The first effect, of course, is to lower the acidity of the cider. In malolactic fermentation, malic acid is converted to lactic acid. Malic acid is much more acidic than lactic acid. Since the malic acid turns into lactic acid, the acidity decreases and can reach half of what it was at the beginning. The second thing is an increase in pH. The decrease in acidity is represented by an increase in pH, and this can allow unwanted bacteria to develop. Thirdly, there will be a decrease in the taste of the fruit. Malic acid is part of the flavor profile of apples, and if it is not present, the flavor of the apples decreases. Also, as a result of the bacterial activity, there is also creation of phenolic flavors and aromas, as we know from beer. Spicy, smoky, plastic, ash, and burnt aromas. These bacteria, especially Pediococcus, can also produce diacetyl. And lastly, aromas and taste of a rodent cage. But there are also good effects on the cider. We actually have an increase in the stability of the cider because there is nothing left to ferment. And lastly, where can we encounter MLF flavors? In English and French ciders, herbs and spice ciders, and fruit ciders, MLF is okay. In the New England apple vine and ice cider, it's always a fault. At this point, we finish discussing the subject of MLF in the scope of this course. And now, after MLF, let's move on to discuss keeving. So, what is keeving or a keeve, and what is its purpose? At the heart of the process, there is the removal of yeast nutrients that came from the apples or pears. The purpose of removing the nutrients is to starve the yeast before the fermentation ends in dry cider. That way, the cider will be bottled with some residual sugars without back sweetening the cider. What is the keeving process? The process begins with washing and crushing the fruits as a normal cider. The fruit should be very ripe because during the sweating process, the enzymes lower the nitrogen level in the fruit. After crushing, the pulp is usually left in a cold maceration for a few hours up to a whole day. The process is done at low temperatures so that yeast contamination does not develop. It is possible to perform maceration in any cider, but in a keeved cider, it is most common. Ciders that have undergone keeving are different from regular ciders because of two unique processes: enzymatic lowering of nutrients and multiple rackings. After the maceration and pressing, pectin methylesterase and calcium are added to remove nutrients. Pectin methylesterase converts pectin into pectic acid and uses nitrogen in the process. After that, the pectic acid combines with calcium and turns into a gel that floats on top of the CO2. Since the process uses calcium, calcium is added also to the must. After the gel is formed, between the gel and the protein that floats on the top and the bottom is the must with low nutrients. This must is transferred to another container and a slow fermentation begins. Every few days, another racking is done to get rid of yeast that work quickly and sink. It may take several times. Finally, the cider is bottled when the fermentation is very, very slow using champagne bottles, which can withstand the pressure. And of course, now we'll move on to talk about the sensory effects of keeving on ciders. The juice becomes darker during maceration and keeving. Also, the juice becomes very clear because the gel catches particles and yeast. In addition, fermentation will be very, very slow and will stop sooner. And finally, since there are lots of rackings in the process, a lot of cider is lost. Besides the effect of the keeve itself, the following things are also expected. Alcohol tends to be low or very low. There will be a noticeable sweetness, and there can be very high carbonation, since the cider is bottled while it is still fizzing. Finally, there can be oxidation defects in case the fermenter was not full between rackings. This is where we finish the topic of keeving in the scope of this course. And after talking about keeving, we move on to talk about using sulfates. Let's start with the question, what is sulfate? Sulfate refers to sulfur dioxide, usually in the form of potassium metabisulfate or sodium metabisulfate. These materials are known as Camden tablets, which are calibrated to give just over 50 ppm of sulfur dioxide per gallon per tablet. The roles of sulfur in cider are antimicrobial and antioxidant. Homebrewers use these tablets to bind chlorine or chloramine in the brewing water. The use of sulfur in alcohol has existed for more than 1,000 years, especially in grape wine, and it's also created naturally by the yeast during fermentation. Sulfites have also been used throughout history as preservatives, although today most of them are outlawed. A small number of people, especially asthma patients, can get a strong reaction when exposed to sulfur in alcoholic beverages. The use of sulfur in cider is not mandatory, but it is recommended to prevent infections. The use of sulfur for sanitation is popular because it prevents bacteria from working and has less effect on the yeast. In addition, in most cases, we will use potassium metabisulfate since we want to limit the amount of sodium in the cider, and potassium is also a nutrient for the yeast. What are the effects of sulfite in a cider? Sulfite kills or impairs the activity of natural yeast, kills or impairs the activity of other microorganisms, helps prevent malolactic fermentation, binds to oxidation products, and helps maintain the color of the cider by fighting oxidation. But it also has negative effects on the cider. Sulfites can be felt as the aroma of a burnt match, and excessive use can make the cider feel metallic or bitter. And as I said, a small proportion of people will have a serious allergic reaction to sulfur in alcohol. In most cases, it is used in combination with sorbate in the stabilization phase of the cider. Since sulfites have such important uses, timing and amounts of sulfites are very important. A concentration of 1 ppm of sulfites kills most microorganisms. Low amounts will only work on some microorganisms, and high amounts will also kill commercial yeasts. There are also legal limits on how much sulfites can be used, and they vary from country to country. Home cider makers are advised to avoid general sulfite levels below 200 ppm. Also, as we already know, biological processes are a bit more complicated than they seem, and the cider maker can't just add a few Camden tablets to the fermenter and think it will work. When sulfite enters the drink, it is free, but it can bind to a lot of things like acetaldehyde, pectinase byproducts, sugar, and of course, oxygen. The amount of sulfite that will remain free depends on the amount of sulfite the cider maker will use and the pH of the cider. You can see in the table that the higher the pH, the more sulfite is needed. Basically, to have 1 ppm in the must, 50 times that are needed. After we talked about how much sulfite should be used, we should ask when to add the sulfite. Sulfite can be added at different times in the cider making process, but the purpose of each addition is different. Sulfites that are added before fermentation are mainly to prevent contamination by unwanted organisms, especially bacteria. On the other hand, sulfites which are added after fermentation are used to protect against spoilage and oxidation. In addition, if the pH of the must or the cider is close to 4 it is recommended to add acid to avoid using a very high sulfite ratio. As I said, the higher the pH, the more sulfite is needed. Of course, in the end, what is interesting to us is what are the effects of sulfiting on the cider from a sensory point of view. If there are high amounts of sulfite, we will feel them as burning, smoke, or a lit match. If there is a little bit of sulfite and it evaporates quickly, it is not considered a defect in the cider. Note that sulfite is different from sulfide, which is the smell of a boiled egg. In addition, cider that does not have enough sulfite is not protected against bacteria and can restart fermentation in the bottle. Likewise, it is not protected against oxidation and will darken quickly. That's it. This is where we finish talking about sulfites and move on to talk about the use of oak in cider. Oak wood can come from all kinds of places, but mostly it will come from America, Hungary, and France. In addition, it is customary to char the wood, and there is a wide range of degrees of charring that can be reached. The wood can come in various forms, from barrels of different sizes, strips of wood, parts of a barrel, chips, cubes, powder, and wood extract. In most cases, it is easiest to find chips and cubes. The contact time with the wood should be monitored. As a rule of thumb, smaller shapes of wood will take less time to transfer flavor because there is more surface area in contact with the cider. Oak is an excellent addition to cider, although it should be low. Cider with high levels of wood should be served under specialty cider or perry. Low use of oak means that it should not be possible to differentiate between the tannins that come from the wood and the tannins that come from the fruit. Oak adds structure or body, complexity, and additional flavors such as oak, wood, toast, and vanilla, along with color according to the charring level. It should be noted that oak ciders should not be too astringent. After talking about wood-aged ciders, we will move on to talk about stabilizing the cider after fermentation. Stabilizing the cider is attempting to keep the cider with the flavors and aromas unchanged over time. Changes can be related to the age of the cider since making, but those will be discussed in the next section. Or they can be related to particles or haze. Since haze affects stability and shelf life, clarification will be discussed here. The particles that create haze can be proteins, pectin, starch, polyphenols, spices, or bacterial contamination. Additionally, fruit made from pear juice is notorious for being one of the hardest to clarify, so some haze is allowed in perry. The most common method for stabilizing cider is to use a combination of potassium metabisulfate and potassium sorbate. These additives stun the yeast and do not allow them to divide again. They will still be there, but they won't be able to restart the fermentation. The problem with this is that there are people who are allergic to sulfates, and if you add too much sorbate, an aroma of geranium leaves can develop if there is malolactic fermentation after that. To remove haze from the cider, you can use clarification agents. These ingredients can speed up the clarification of the cider. There are several types of clarifying agents that can be used to clarify the cider according to the cause of the haze. Pectin is the substance that creates a gel in apples discussed at the beginning of the presentation. To break it down, the cider maker will use an enzyme called pectinase, which breaks down the gel. In most cases, the enzyme is added at the beginning of fermentation, and it works better above 15 degrees Celsius. We will not add this enzyme to the juice that goes through keeving, because we want the gel to remove the nitrogen. Amounts and form of use vary according to the manufacturer, so check the instructions before using pectinase. Proteins, on the other hand, are positively charged, while yeast are negatively charged. Clarifying agents such as Irish moss bind proteins electrostatically and cause them to sink. Since some of the clarifying agents are positively charged and some are negatively charged, both are used to precipitate yeast and proteins. For best results, first use the positive clarifying agents and then use the negative ones separately. Most ciders that have finished fermentation will mature naturally with time and rakings, but most cider makers don't want to lose so much liquid, so they add clarifying agents. Before clarification is attempted, fermentation must be over. If the fermentation is stuck, the cider will not clarify. If the cider has finished fermentation, the cider maker will start with cooling to 6 to 12 degrees less than the fermentation temperature. If fruit was added, pectinase can help clear pectin haze. If these steps did not lead to a satisfactory result, charge clarifying agents should be used. As a last resort, a mechanical filter can be used, but the filter can cause oxidation and color loss. It should be noted at this time that there is still microflora in the cider, and if there are still sugars left, or if the cider has been back sweetened, fermentation can start again and make the cider cloudy. Therefore, the cider must be stabilized after fermentation by eliminating the microflora. To kill the microflora, the cider can be pasteurized or alternatively, potassium sorbate can be used to kill the yeast. After stabilizing and clarifying the cider, let's move on to talk about the effects of aging on the cider. Aging cider causes the following: esters, bitterness, and flavor intensity decrease. The alcoholic taste becomes softer and rounder, and the color becomes a little lighter as a result of sedimentation of substances. On the other hand, proteins, tannins, and yeast and other substances settle in the bottle, and the flavors become smoother and more unified. If there is contact with oxygen while aging, more negative effects will occur. The color will become darker. There will be loss of clarity. Aroma and taste of fresh fruit will turn into dried fruit. Acetaldehyde will be formed as a result of oxidation of alcohol. And in addition, aerobic bacteria that needs oxygen to work, such as acetobacter, can work and create sharp acetic acid. If cider with a normal alcohol percentage oxidizes, an aroma and flavor of wet cardboard and honey will show. Oxidation has only one result that will be positive, and that is the formation of a sherry flavor. This happens when melanoidins found in darker ciders with a lot of alcohol oxidizes. Therefore, if you age, you should age strong ciders with melanoidins. To delay the effects of oxygen, the cider maker can use wax on the corks, use synthetic corks instead of wooden corks, and not use crown caps. In addition, while aging, further measures can be taken to slow down the rate of oxidation of the cider. As a rule of thumb, a 10-degree increase in temperature cuts aging time in half. It is also very important to avoid exposure to light, which can harm the aromas of esters and phenols in a cider, and to avoid mechanical agitation, which can cause haze. After discussing the impact of aging on the cider, we will move on to talk about how to age the cider. Cider can be aged in the bottle, which has the benefit of very good protection against oxidation. But, on the other hand, it is difficult for the cider maker to make adjustments and changes. The second method is to age the whole batch together. With this method, the cider maker can fix the balance of the cider easily after aging. Fermentation can end, the cider can become clearer, and the final product will be much more consistent between bottle to bottle. Aging can be done either in inert containers, such as stainless steel or glass, or in containers that allow the passing of oxygen, which are mainly from wood. After discussing aging, let's move on to the last topic of today's presentation, which is blending. Blending is mixing the cider with another drink. It can be other cider, fermented fruits, spice tinctures, mead, and more. Blending is essentially another method of balancing the final cider. The common reasons to choose to blend ciders can be to add acidity or tannins, to add sweetness if the cider is too sour, to add complexity if the cider is one dimensional, to create a different style of cider, to create a unique cider, or to get rid of a bad batch. And if we blend it, it will be possible to drink. To blend, first the cider maker will taste each of the drinks separately and analyze their flavor components with the strengths of each of the ingredients. Next, the cider maker will think about the concept they want to get from the final drink. Then, they will try it in small amounts while writing down the amounts. If it doesn't turn out well, they can adjust it until they get to a good result. And only at the end, they will blend on a larger scale according to the quantities they used in the small experiment. And that's it. This is where we end the presentation of today about advanced topics in cider making. I hope that the talk was informative and interesting. I just want to remind you that if you like the video, please hit the like button to know when the next videos come out. If you have questions, please write them down in the comments and I will answer. In addition, you can see my social media handles change on the screen or find them in the description of this video. You're welcome to follow me to know when my next projects come out. Thank you for listening. I was Omer Basha and see you in the next meeting where we will discuss evaluating cider.